The Ashford curse begins, 1721, and the death at Greyhall. Inheritance nobody wanted. The year is 1721. England is recovering from the South Sea bubble collapse, and the countryside is divided between quiet recovery and aristocratic denial. In the remote stretch of Derbyshire stands Greyhall Manor, a sprawling estate ringed by misty moorland and stony farmland, far from the watchful eyes of London society. It is here, among cold stone walls and overgrown hedges, that the legacy of the Ashford family begins its long descent into infamy. You are standing just outside the tall iron gates of Greyhall. They creak in the wind, not from disrepair, but from disuse. The house itself has stood for over a century, originally built by Edward Ashford in 1603. But the tale you are about to hear begins with his great-grandson Thomas Ashford, a reclusive barrister who inherited Greyhall under strange and tragic circumstances. Thomas was not a man of ambition. He lived modestly in London, occupying a narrow flat above a law office near Holborn. He was the third son of a third son, and by every account, expected to remain a footnote in his family's legacy. That changed on one frost-bitten January morning when a messenger arrived at his doorstep with a letter sealed in black wax. It bore the family crest, a crow holding a ring in its beak. The letter informed him that his cousin, Lord Frederick Ashford, had died in his sleep. The remaining family, 2 aunts and a distant nephew, had all perished in the previous year due to typhus and a carriage accident, respectively. Thomas, by rights of birth and blood, was now Lord of Greyhall. That very week, Thomas packed his few belongings and traveled north, leaving behind the gas lamps and muddy cobblestones of the city. He arrived at Greyhall on a damp Thursday, met only by the housekeeper, Mrs. Thistle, an aged widow with a limp and a voice like dry parchment, and the groundskeeper, Elias, who had worked for the family for nearly 40 years. The manor was in a state of uneasy silence. Rooms were shuttered, clocks had stopped, dust rested like ash on every surface, and yet nothing had been looted or disturbed. It was as if the house had been waiting for him. Thomas quickly discovered that his cousin had kept peculiar habits. In the East Wing, a private library was filled with books on alchemy, old ecclesiastical law, and medical curiosities. There was even an entire shelf devoted to ancient Roman rituals concerning inheritance and burial. In the cellar, crates of foreign glassware and surgical instruments had been arranged with obsessive precision. And in the master bedroom, a small silver box sat atop the writing desk, sealed and unmarked. He did not open it, not immediately. Instead, Thomas set about reordering the estate. He hired a young maid from the nearby village of Buxton. He reopened the drawing rooms and walked the moors each morning. But though he followed routine, Greyhall had a way of resisting normalcy. Mice died in neat lines along the pantry wall. Fires burned unevenly. The clocks, even once repaired, continued to stop at 3:17 am, precisely the hour when Lord Frederick was said to have died. There were also the sounds, whispers in the back corridors, a dragging noise across the attic floor, a rhythmic tapping from inside the library walls. When questioned, Mrs. Thistle merely nodded and muttered, "It's just the old ways of the house. They'll settle down once you've been here longer." Elias, more direct, told Thomas not to spend time in the orchard after dusk. The trees were never right after the gallows was torn down, he explained, referring to a small grove beyond the estate where, allegedly, a private execution scaffold once stood during the Civil War. Still, Thomas was a man of the Enlightenment. He considered himself rational and not prone to superstition. But that resolve began to erode the night he opened the silver box. Inside were 4 items: a small ring of braided human hair, a note written in Latin, a dried sprig of belladonna, and a faded daguerreotype of a woman with empty eyes. The Latin inscription, once translated, read, "To receive without question is to inherit the weight of all their sins." Within days of opening the box, Thomas fell ill. His symptoms were curious, not the fever and chills of influenza, but a persistent ringing in the ears, blurred vision, and vivid dreams of fire and screaming faces. He confined himself to bed, leaving Mrs. Thistle to manage the house. Elias, ever loyal, remained outside the bedroom at night with a lantern. Saying little but always present. By the third week of his illness, Thomas began writing letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed to old colleagues, others to names no one recognized. All were sealed and placed in a drawer, which would later be found locked tight. The key missing. Then came the storm. It lasted for 2 full days, rain pounding like fists on the glass, lightning illuminating the halls and flashes. On the second night, Elias disappeared. His lantern was found just outside the orchard, its glass cracked. A trail of muddy footprints led to the trees, but did not return. When the storm passed, Thomas Ashford was dead. He had locked himself in the library. The housekeeper broke down the door at dawn. Thomas sat in the leather chair by the hearth, eyes open, blood streaking from his ears. On the floor beside him was the Latin note from the silver box, now written over in his own hand with only 3 words in English. It never ends. The inquest declared a stroke. No signs of trauma, no evidence of foul play. The coroner, a family acquaintance from Matlock, made a note about extreme nervous exhaustion, but did not investigate further. Greyhall was shuttered again. And the Ashford line? It passed next to a cousin in Sussex, young Charles Ashford, aged 19, who would inherit the house a year later, and with it, the strange legacy that had already taken root. But the question remained, what had begun the decline of this family so long ago? Was it a curse? Or merely a string of misfortunes stretched across time and coincidence? And why did Thomas write, "It never ends," before his death? The Ashford curse begins, 1721, and the death at Greyhall, second heir, and the locked room when Charles Ashford arrived at Greyhall Manor in the spring of 1722. The hedges had nearly swallowed the main gate. Moss had begun to climb the limestone walls, and birds nested in the broken eaves above the upper windows. The manor had stood silent for over a year. The villagers of Buxton said it should have stayed that way. Charles, unlike Thomas, was not a man of quiet intellect or modest ambition. He had grown up in Brighton, near the sea, and lived a life more interested in fencing matches, poetry salons, and expensive coats than family history. He was the only child of Thomas's cousin Richard, a failed playwright turned importer of Dutch linen. Charles viewed his inheritance of Greyhall as a fortunate twist one that would grant him land, wealth, and an aristocratic title, all without the burden of earning them. But he arrived at the estate alone. No servants, no family, no entourage. He said he preferred to reclaim the house before introducing his friends from the city. In reality, few volunteered to join him. Londoners had heard unsettling things, and the locals, who had tended to Greyhall's land for generations, had grown wary. A new Ashford met new trouble. On his first night in the manor, Charles explored every room with a lantern in one hand and a glass of sherry in the other. He made notes on repairs, loose floorboards, cracked windows, collapsing plaster, and joked aloud to the empty rooms about how melodramatic the place was. He laughed at the creaking doors. He mocked the library's odd collection. He even made fun of the fireplace carvings, a series of biblical scenes depicting punishment and suffering. And then he found the locked drawer in Thomas's writing desk. The keys had long since gone missing, so Charles pried it open with a fire iron. Inside were the sealed letters. There were 19 in total, each addressed to a different person, including 2 with only single names, Judith and Reverend Mallory. One bore no name at all, just a wax seal with the family crest. He opened that one first. The note inside was brief. "If you are reading this, do not return to the orchard. You must burn what is buried. The house won't release it otherwise." It was unsigned. Charles dismissed it as the product of his cousin's fevered final days. Burn what? Is buried? He scoffed. Nonsense. He placed the letters back in the drawer and promptly forgot them until the first night. He heard the thumping dot. It began precisely at 3:17 a.m., a low, irregular knock sometimes on the wall behind the bed, other times beneath the floorboards, or just outside the door. It would stop the moment he lit a lamp, and there was never any sign of disturbance. The house, it seemed, was mocking him after 3 nights of this. Charles moved to the west wing, where the windows still held strong and the wallpaper was less faded. He brought a pistol with him and set it beside the bed, more out of irritation than fear. But that didn't stop the thumping dot, nor the whispering, or the crying dot. By the end of the second week, Charles began writing his own letters, not of farewell, but requests for company. He invited a few of his acquaintances from London, fellow heirs, dilettantes, and one woman, a stage actress named Lydia Barr. Most declined. Only 2 accepted: Robert Finch, a failed poet who owed Charles money, and Godfrey Lanes, a minor noble who was more curious than cautious. They arrived at Greyhall on a foggy May morning, eager for amusement. At first, the 3 men drank, laughed, and even staged mock seances in the dining hall. Godfrey wore a velvet robe and waved incense about, pretending to summon the ghost of Ashford past. Charles was pleased. The house, he said, was no match for reason and ridicule. But something about the house resisted their games. Robert began complaining of headaches and nausea. He claimed the walls in the guest room were breathing. He left within 3 days, pale and speechless. Godfrey stayed longer. One evening, he wandered into the orchard after dinner, curious about the gallows tree Charles had mentioned. The next morning, he was found sleeping at the base of the old oak, face covered in scratches, lips blue, and hands tightly gripping a rusted, unmarked iron key. He could not remember how he got there, or where the key had come from. Charles took the key and placed it on the mantel in the drawing room. He joked that it probably opened a demon door, but he didn't throw it away. That week, Lydia Barr finally accepted the invitation and arrived in a coach from London. She brought with her a trunk of gowns, a cat named Thistle, and a very specific warning. She had visited a spiritualist before leaving the city, who had warned her not to speak aloud the names of the dead inside the manor. Charles, amused and a little enchanted, dismissed it as superstition. But Lydia remained serious. She insisted on sleeping in a room on the 3rd floor, far from the orchard, and nearer the chapel, which she claimed smelled clean. They shared wine that night. Charles seemed invigorated by her presence. He showed her the library, the hidden stairwell behind the linen cupboard, and even the odd painting of Thomas Ashford, whose eyes seemed to follow visitors across the room. But it was Lydia who noticed something strange. In the family record book, kept in the study and dating back to the 1500s, every Ashford's birth and death was meticulously recorded, except for one, Elizabeth Ashford. Born 1670, no death date, nothing else. No marriage, no children. Just that single entry, and her name had been written in a different ink, a deeper red, almost like dried blood. Lydia asked Charles about it, but he had no answer. He'd never noticed the name before. Later that week, Lydia fell ill. Her symptoms mirrored Thomas's. She complained of humming sounds, blurred vision, and a pressure in her chest. One morning, she woke with scratches on her arms. Despite sleeping with the door locked and her cat resting beside her, she demanded they leave. Charles agreed, though reluctantly. He told her he would arrange passage to London within the week, but she never made it. On the 5th night, Lydia was found at the bottom of the staircase, her neck broken, her face frozen in terror. No sign of a fall. No tripped carpet, no broken railing. The inquest labeled it an accident. Charles buried her in the chapel cemetery 2 days later, in a plot that once belonged to the family's chapel priest, whose body had never been found. After that, something changed in Charles. He stopped inviting Guests, he stopped shaving. He roamed the halls at night, mumbling to himself. Pacing before the locked cellar. And he began referring to Elizabeth Ashford as if she were still alive. Elizabeth says we shouldn't go into the orchard, he told the maid one morning. Elizabeth wants the key buried. Elizabeth is waiting. By the autumn of that year, the manor had fallen into complete disrepair. Servants left. The villagers refused to deliver goods. Only Charles remained, wandering the estate in increasingly tattered clothing, always holding the key. And then one night, he disappeared. A search was conducted. Nothing. Only the library showed signs of activity, books scattered, candle wax spilled, and once again, the silver box returned to the writing desk, closed but not sealed. Inside it, the ring of braided hair, and a note, this time written in two hands, one belonging to Charles, the other in the same deep red ink as Elizabeth's. Entry in the family record. It read, "The third will come." The orchard remembers, but who was Elizabeth Ashford? And what happened in the orchard that caused every heir to spiral into madness, illness, or death? The Ashford curse begins, 1721, and the death at Greyhall. Orchard remembers autumn faded into winter. Snow fell early on Greyhall Manor, blanketing the moors in silence and ash-colored frost. No fires burned in the hearths. No lights flickered behind the tall windows. The estate sat alone, breathing in the wind, waiting. Charles Ashford was gone, vanished. Without a trace. No body was ever recovered. No note was left behind, save the chilling message in the silver box, "The third will come." The orchard remembers. For months, Greyhall remained vacant, watched only by wary villagers and the occasional passing tax assessor. Yet even the Crown's men didn't linger long. It was said the air inside the manor was thick, the rooms unusually cold, the chapel darker than it should have been. Rumors spread of ghostly figures walking the orchard, of bells ringing in the chapel, though the rope had long since rotted away. But the Ashford line did not end with Charles. In 1725, a new heir arrived. Rev. Thomas Mallory, a distant cousin by marriage and the unlikely next of kin. A Cambridge-educated rector turned rural cleric, Mallory had lived a quiet life in the southern parish of Loxley. He was known for two things, his rigid Anglican faith and his obsessive interest in spiritual afflictions, what he called residual suffering. Or in plainer terms, the sins that lingered after death. It was perhaps no coincidence that he had once received a letter from Thomas Ashford, a letter that went unanswered and was now lost to history. Rev. Mallory came to Greyhall not to claim it as a residence, but to cleanse it. He viewed the estate as a spiritual wound, something festering across generations. He brought only a few belongings, his Bible, a leather-bound notebook, a crucifix, and a map of the manor. He took up residence in the caretaker's cottage, refusing to sleep inside the main house. His journals from this time still survive, tucked away in the Derbyshire archives. They form the clearest record of the manor's descent and offer, for the first time, some connection to Elizabeth Ashford. October 3, 1725. The manor resists entry. Even in daylight, its halls feel hollowed by dread. Something clings to the wood itself. I have begun prayers in the chapel, but sense a presence behind me as I speak. October 7th. Found the painting of the woman again, the one without a name. Charles had placed it in the attic. I moved it to the drawing room for closer study. Her eyes seemed familiar. I cannot explain why. October 10th. Opened the cellar with the old key. Found several jars filled with brine and small bones. One contained teeth. Human, I believe. October 12th. The orchard is louder than the house. I avoid it at night. The trees creak not with wind, but with breath. On October 15th, Rev. Mallory made a discovery that would connect the pieces of the Ashford mystery in disturbing clarity. Behind the chapel altar, in a concealed cavity sealed with mortar, he uncovered a bundle of parchment wrapped in linen. It had been hidden behind a false panel, long forgotten. The contents were a collection of letters, prayers, and a confession written in a jagged, unsteady hand signed by Judith Ashford, 1694. Judith was Elizabeth's younger sister. According to the confession, Elizabeth Ashford had been committed to the manor in 1689 after a series of violent outbursts and unrighteous behavior. She was said to hear voices, see things no others could, and claimed to possess knowledge of events before they happened. Though she was never formally diagnosed psychiatry, being still centuries from proper development, Judith described her as unwell of the spirit and taken by grief that knows no earthly origin. But then, the letter turned darker. Father allowed the ritual. He said it was the only way to save our name. We buried the infant beneath the hanging tree, as instructed. Elizabeth said it would stop the curse, but she lied. It has made it worse. Now she will not die. She walks the halls, though she is not seen. We locked her below in the hidden chamber. She does not age. Her skin is like wax. God, forgive us. Rev. Mallory, unnerved but determined, focused his search on the orchard. He returned to the grove that had once held the gallows and began digging. By candlelight, beneath the roots of the oldest tree, he uncovered bones small and malformed. Infant bones, wrapped in deteriorated linen and tucked beside a rusted iron ring. The journal ends abruptly the next day. The final entry reads, October 16th. The wind has changed. The house groans like a thing waking. I hear her singing beneath the floor. It is not Elizabeth's voice, and yet it is hers. I go now to confront what must be ended. If I do not return, seal this place. Let no one else carry this sin forward. The orchard remembers. And now, so do I. Rev. Mallory was never seen again. The house was officially closed and condemned in 1726. A legal dispute over the estate remained unresolved until the mid-19th century, by which time the Ashford name had largely vanished from public record. What little family survived changed their names, moved abroad, or refused to acknowledge their ancestry. Today, Greyhall Manor is gone, reduced to a stone foundation and overgrown hedges. The orchard remains, gnarled and twisted, avoided by locals. Even in broad daylight, farmers claim their crops grow crooked if planted nearby. No animals will nest in the trees. As for Elizabeth Ashford, no death certificate, no burial record, only a name in a red ink that never fades, and the whisper of a story passed between generations. That once, long ago, a woman bargained for her family's survival at the cost of her soul, and that the orchard and the house it fed never let her leave. But what was the true origin of the Ashford curse? Was it a product of superstition, coincidence, or a long-forgotten ritual whose meaning is now lost to time? And if someone somewhere bears the Ashford blood still, does the curse still breathe?